Hello. Today we will continue with Chapter 15 notes. We'll do Chapter 15 Part 2, in effect, which will talk about monetary policy and interest rates as a tool of monetary policy. So I'm actually going to go start back at the beginning and run through the first couple of slides very quickly. So Chapter 15 in its entirety is about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve System, often shortened to the Fed. Last time we examined how the Fed is organized, those 12 district banks. The president appoints governors of each of those 12 banks. Those 12 women and men make up the board of governors. They have smaller committees, the most important being the Federal Open Markets Committee, or FOMC, that helps set interest rates and determine monetary policy for the country. Get started there. And so that's how the Fed looks as a structure. This is a map of the Federal Reserve districts. There are 12 of them. They're sort of a capital of each of those 12 districts. St. Louis is one, Kansas City, Chicago, Minneapolis, Cleveland. There is a Federal Reserve Bank in each of those cities. And the Fed does lots of stuff. The Fed controls monetary policy, which we'll explore more today, but it also has lots of roles outside of simply monetary policy. So probably some of the most important of which are these. It does check clearing, which again we discussed last time. It does FDIC, the insurance of your bank's money, and consumer protection. It actually sends accountants into member banks and makes sure they're doing what's right. I'm going to go back real fast to the map of our banks there. And so I mentioned in our previous notes, but I didn't have a dollar bill on me, that in each bill, so there you see it says K, which is my bill, and there's a K in that circle, and the next one is an 11, and there's actually 4 11s on this bill. Like there's an 11, there's an 11, you get it. And underneath that K, if you can read that, I bet you can't, but underneath the K it says Dallas, Texas, which makes sense because of course here's 11, Dallas, Texas. This bill is a 1A. The letter just corresponds to the number, right? So A is 1, B would be 2, C would be 3. Anyway, an A1 I know is from Boston, Massachusetts. And my favorite bill, type of bill anyway, hey, it's an 11H, because H is the 8th letter. I mean an 8. Did I say 11? It's an 8H, because 8H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. You get it. And of course, that means that's a St. Louis bill. And right there underneath that H in the black, it says St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, our Federal Reserve Bank for us here in Region 8. Anyway, so there's a little bit about Fed structure. But the big important thing the Fed does determines so much about how the world looks, how the country looks, is it runs monetary policy. So basically there are sort of two kinds of monetary policy. Really, monetary policy exists on a continuum. Like there is way over here extremely loose monetary policy, and then way over here is very, guess what the opposite of loose monetary policy is? Yeah, very good, tight monetary policy. It's not like you have to be loose or tight. It's like you can be somewhere along this line, right? And so let's loosen a little bit or tighten a little bit. Let's tighten a whole bunch. I don't know. But anyway, right? So you get it. So it's this long line, and sort of at one end is loose and at the other end is tight, and monetary policy falls somewhere along those lines. And it changes over time, and it changes based on the people in charge of the Fed. It changes on politicians and political considerations. Anyway, let's actually just step back and examine what on earth is loose monetary policy. What does that mean? Now, we've already discussed what monetary policy means. That's how much money exists. Literally, how many of these do you print? Do you just print 1? Or do you print 2? Or do you print 3? And of course, 3 is the loosest monetary policy. I have the most bills. Maybe the Fed decided it was only ever going to make 2. So it's kind of medium monetary policy. Or 1, that would be the tightest monetary policy, the fewest bills. And of course, the fewer bills that exist, one would expect under almost all circumstances, the more that one is worth, the more it would bind. And the more bills that exist, well, sort of the less value any one individual bill has, the less any one bill would be worth. Meaning, of course, if there's only $1 bill in the whole world, well, a gallon of milk would probably cost a penny. But if there were $3 of printed in the world, right, a gallon of milk might cost 3 pennies. So, it is not a perfect correlation, right? But anyway, so that's sort of the overall sense. How much is money worth? Well, including other factors, one of the most important is how many of those bills exist. So under loose monetary policy, the government simply prints more bills. So you have lots of money out there that exists under loose monetary policy. And the text goes in some ways like it provides cheaper credit, typically lowering interest rates. And we'll examine the interest rate thing in just a second. But in effect, what I want us to know is loose monetary policy means there is cheaper credit, and literally there is just simply more money around. So that's sort of one end of the monetary policy spectrum. The loosest monetary policy is just print as much money as you can, sort of, but print a lot of money. And then the opposite, of course, is tight monetary policy. And tight monetary policy is the exact opposite, right? Fewer dollar bills out there, and you do that by making credit expensive. And one of the main ways you do that is raising interest rates. And again, we'll look at the interest rate scenario here more in depth in just a second. But in effect, loose monetary policy, cheap credit, lots of money, run the printing presses. Tight monetary policy is the opposite, fewer bills printed and expensive credit. Okay, so there are three tools that the Fed has to operate either loose or tight monetary policy. And we'll examine one today and two more in our notes the next time. So today we just want to get our heads around the notion that like here's this Fed and its main job, although it has other jobs, is to run monetary policy, determining how much money exists and then making that happen. And it really has tight and loose monetary policy to keep in mind, and the balance of those two and where we fall on this line, which one should we do? And if we pick some spot, hey, we want kind of medium tight monetary policy or super loose, whatever, right? When the Fed determines this is the kind of monetary policy we want, then of course the important job is to say, how are we going to do that? And so we're going to look at interest rates, because the main way the Fed determines loose, tight, how it tries to hit that monetary policy target, the main way it does that is by indirect control of interest rates in the American economy. So the Fed has direct control over two interest rates that have no direct impact on your life ever and will not ever, unless you come to be CEO, head of a major bank in the country, probably. Which good luck to you guys. But in case that doesn't happen. So anyway, the Fed, as we've talked about, does not really have any like consumer banking role, right? You can't go walk into a Fed bank and open an account or anything. So who is it a bank for? Well, almost literally, it is a bank for banks. Now, it is also the government's bank. It's a little interesting, but for now, in thinking about the Fed's role with interest rates, let's just think about it is a bank for banks. So I bank at UMB. Yeah. I go and deposit a bunch of money because I clean up my sock drawer and I find all this change. Maybe the UMB ends up with all of this extra cash, more than it wants in its drawers at the end of business today, right? Have you ever thought, what does a bank do with that money? So banks don't keep all of the money in their own bank, right? They go put it somewhere else, and most banks use the Fed bank. So literally, they will come and take cash out of my little UMB in Collinsville, Illinois, and drive it 11 miles west across the river and a bridge, right, and go to downtown St. Louis and deposit that money in the Federal Reserve Bank. No Federal Reserve Bank in the history of the country has ever successfully been robbed. A couple of attempts, but quite secure places. Anyway, so they're a bank for banks. The Fed takes banks' money, right? And then it also loans banks money, which is also pretty interesting, right? And actually is much more important on this interest rate side, and we'll talk about that. But so like if I need a loan to buy a car or a house or whatever, right? Where do I go? Go to a bank, go to UMB. What if UMB needs a loan? What if my bank needs a loan? Like they don't get to print money, right? So where do they come up with $100,000 for me if I walk down there and want to borrow $100,000 to buy a house? So on the one hand, they of course want money from other depositors, right? So Mr. Randall goes and banks at UMB also. He deposits his paycheck there. I show up an hour later and say I need to borrow $100,000 for a new house. They may very well take some of Randall's money and give it to me. But if there's not enough money there to give me $100,000, does my bank say, oh, sorry, Schusky, we can't do the loan. Go to a different bank that has more money? They might have to, but you know what they really want to do is loan me that money. Why? Why would they be so interested in that? How do you think a bank makes money? So that bank will pay Randall, right? Randall just went and deposited his check there in his savings account. That bank will pay Randall, let's say, 1% interest on his savings account, right? A lot of you guys have savings accounts, you get paid interest, right? Deposit $100, wait a year, you have $101 if you're getting paid 1% interest. Woo! If I go borrow $100 from a bank, though, and I say, hey, I promise to pay you back in a year, bank, the bank will say, sure, here's $100, Schusky, we trust you. But they'll charge me interest. And what interest do you think they'll charge me? I guarantee you more than 1%. Let's say 5%. So I have to pay the bank back $105. So think about that. Randall just handed the bank $100, and they will give Randall back $101 in a year. And as soon as he walks out the door of the bank, I walk in the door of the bank, and I take that $100. They give me Randall's $100. I take it. But in 1 year, I have to go and hand them $105 back. And they have to take, of that 105, right, 101 and hand it to Randall. And they just made $4 for, in effect, doing nothing, being the money middleman. I should have given Randall, or Randall should have given me that $100, right? And I should have given Randall $102 or $103, because then I would have saved money and he would have made more money. Instead, that $4 of profit, right, 101 to 105, just simply goes to the bank for acting like that middleman to, organize Randall and me borrowing and lending each other's money. That's fundamentally how banks operate. They take depositors' money and pay them a lower interest rate, and then they take that money and lend it out and charge borrowers a higher interest rate, and they make the difference, right, of interest. So who determines that interest rate? Do banks get to pick? Like, are they paying Randall 1 or charging me 7, or, who decides? So yes, banks completely have their autonomy. It's their right, whatever, to charge any interest rate or pay any interest rate basically they want. Now there's some laws if they get too crazy high. But basically they could say we're going to pay any amount of interest to savers and charge any amount of interest to borrowers. But of course, we rely on competition in a private marketplace. All of these banks doing this, to keep interest rates within a fairly sort of narrow band and low enough for borrowers and theoretically high enough for savers, although that hasn't really been the case in recent years. But anyway, we'll talk more about that. 1 second. Thanks. Travel mug, not a regular coffee mug. Not really a fan. But, anyway, okay, so banks get to pick their own interest rate, except these interest rates the banks pick are almost directly controlled, but not. They are indirectly controlled by the Fed. Here's how. So the Fed sets the first and third bullet point rates. So it's my PowerPoint's weirdly out of order or whatever. But anyway, so let's see if I can make this work. I love it. No, but I went backwards. Okay, thank you. Sorry. So there's the discount rate and the federal funds rate. So those are the two main interest rates, really the only two interest rates that the Fed directly controls. So the Federal Reserve Board, this organization we've been talking about, has complete control over just deciding for all banks. This is what the discount rate is in the country. This is what the federal funds rate is. We'll focus primarily on the discount rate. What is it? It is the interest rate the Fed charges to member banks. So, short little definition, right? Big, important meaning from those few words. UMB doesn't have $100,000 to lend me for my house when I walk in there. UMB says, come back tomorrow, we'll have it. UMB runs over to the Fed and borrows $100,000. Turns around, hands it to me the next day. Here you go, Schusky, here's your nice package loan, $100,000, pay us back X amount of dollars over time, and enjoy your home. Everyone's happy. When my bank, UMB, went across the river to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, when banks go to the Fed and they borrow money, guess what the Fed does? Of course, they charge the private bank interest. So UMB walks into the Fed, borrows $100,000, and the Fed says, hey, you just got to pay this back over X number of years at, and the Fed, of course, picks that interest rate. Let's say the Fed says, hey, UMB, we're going to lend you $100,000 at 1% interest. UMB takes that $100,000, runs over to me, hands me the $100,000 and says, here you go, Schusky, here's $100,000 buy house. That'll be how much interest? Well, I guarantee you one thing, it's more than 1%. And it's probably 6, 7, 8% more than 1%. So if the Fed is charging 1, I am probably getting an interest rate, maybe 6 or 7 actually, percent on that. If the Fed told UMB, hey, we're charging you 5% on this, then literally, right, that $100,000 has a 5% interest charge on it, the cost of money, and UMB takes that 100 grand at 5% interest, goes and hands it to me. What are they going to tell me my mortgage is? I'm going to borrow that 100 grand at how much? I guarantee you it's now more than 5, probably 10, 11, 12% interest. So this gets down to like the 0.25% and sometimes the 0.1% rates, usually quarters. But so the discount rate is always announced by the Fed. They say it to the public. It's for all banks. They don't pick and choose. All banks pay the discount rate, and in effect, 2.25%. Or if they want to loosen monetary policy, they'll go, we're dropping it to 1.5%. But then all of a sudden, oh gosh, we want to tighten. We're going to raise to 6%. Because why? It's the law of demand. If money is cheap, guess what demand for money is? High. If the price of money is high, demand is low. So it's that inverse relationship, the law of demand that we already talked about, right? Cheap strawberries, high demand for strawberries. Expensive strawberries, people don't buy as many strawberries. Money's cheap, people buy money. Money's expensive, people buy less money. Money has a cost, and that cost is interest. So if interest rates are very, very low, hey, 1% interest discount rate, banks can borrow money cheaply. They'll turn around and lend it out cheaply, 5, 6% to everybody. Good time to buy a car, good time to buy a house, good time for a factory to borrow $100 million and build brand new factories everywhere, put plants everywhere, assembly lines everywhere. Absolutely. Interest rates are high. Banks are going to be charged 10, 15% interest because the Fed has raised interest rates dramatically. My home loan is 20%. Ford will have to borrow money at 18%. People are going to borrow tons of money? Some will, sure. Some people still you have to buy a new car, you have to buy a new house, right? Maybe, but lots and lots of people will choose not to buy money or borrow money and pay those super high interest rates versus lots more people and businesses and you name it, entering the market, buying that cheap money. Yeah. So in that way, that's how the Fed has basically direct control over interest rates through the economy, at least very strong indirect control through determining the discount rate, the rate that banks borrow money from the Fed at, right? So then the federal funds rate is a similar operation of interest, but it is just instead of what the Fed charges banks, it's what banks charge banks. So sometimes, just for sake of ease, like literally rather than going across the river and borrowing money from the Fed, maybe my UMB branch can go across the street and borrow money from FCB. Banks borrow and lend money to each other all the time, and they don't get to pick their own interest rate between banks. The Fed picks that as well, and that's called the federal funds rate. But it's very, very similar to the discount rate. Basically, how much are banks borrowing money at? What interest rate are banks paying? And so that determines the price of money, right? And cheaper money, loose monetary policy, there's more money around because more people are borrowing. Expensive money, high interest rates, people borrow less money, therefore there is just less money in your account. Okay? So then the last interest rate listed here is called the prime rate. And the prime rate is not directly set by the Fed, it is set by individual banks. That's the rate that banks charge their best customers. So if I walk in to borrow $100,000, I may get a different interest rate than, the head of Osborne Construction, who has tons of money and borrows money all the time and pays it all back all the time. Blah blah blah. They may trust, right, that the head of Osborne Construction Company in town will be more likely to pay that loan back. So they'll tell him or her, hey, here's that $100,000 at 5% interest. Schusky will charge you 6% interest, right? And then maybe they'll tell Randall, oh my God, that guy's terrible with money, but we're going to charge you 8% interest. But so the best rate they will lend money to anybody, the best rate private banks will lend money to anybody is this prime rate. And it's an important number. Banks announce it publicly. It's published, their prime rate, because all sorts of other loans or interest rates are tied to that prime rate. So like a credit card will say, is our bank's prime rate plus 9% interest. Or we'll give mortgages at prime plus 1. or car loans at prime plus 3. And so if our prime rate is 6, based on a discount rate of 2, so we can borrow money from the Fed at 2, we'll turn around and lend it out to our bust customers at 6, bank will make 4% spread. Following me? But anyway, that prime rate, then they'll tell me, hey, for a home loan, we'll give you prime plus 1% interest. And maybe on a car, they'll say prime plus 3. Why is that? Well, if I borrow money and buy a house and then I stop paying the money back, I lose my job, whatever, right? Well, the bank can come and take my home, and that home has quite a bit of value. If I stop paying on my car loan, well, the bank will try to come and take my car, but my car will probably have lost a lot more value than my home, or I'll have driven off in my car, right? Or whatever. So anyway, almost all interest rates that banks charge are set or determined by the prime rate. In effect, the prime rate is determined by the discount rate. So in that sense, the Fed controls interest rates throughout the economy, and by controlling interest rates, it has a profound impact on how much money exists and our economy as a whole. Okay, so interest rates are the one main important, most publicly discussed, talked about tool of monetary policy, really effective tool to determine how much money exists. But the Fed has 2 more tools, and we'll examine those next time in our next part of notes. Thanks so much for your attention.